Well, yeah, woo, somebody liked it. So good morning and welcome. If you are new here, you don't know me, my name's Steve Boul. I am on the pastoral team here at CF. And joining me this morning is Miriam Knight. You may recognize Miriam from, she's done our welcome, she's led us in communion. If you are connected with the school, she's a chaplain there. And this morning she is going to join me in speaking for her first time. A couple of things you may not know. It's coming. A couple of things you may not know about Miriam. She loves the Word of God. She has her Master's of Divinity from Bethel Seminary in St. Paul. And as you see this morning, that actually became very, very helpful as we give our message this morning. She also loves crafting, which didn't come in quite so handy this week, but might be a point of connection for some of you. So would you please stand on your feet? We want to welcome her. On your feet, there we go. We want to welcome her, we want to honor her, and we want to encourage her as she speaks to us this morning.
Thank you. Good to be with you. Oh, stand on your feet for a second. Okay, we have been practicing throughout this series, saying some true things to one another. So we're going to do that again. I'll lead you through it if you haven't been here. I want you to turn to your neighbor and say, "We are better together."
We are better together.
Okay, now turn to your other neighbor and say, "I am your companion, not your competitor."
I am your companion, not your competitor.
Okay, now look across the room, make eye contact with somebody, and say, "I will choose to connect and not compare."
I will choose to connect and not compare.
Well done.
That's great. So now you all can take your seats, and we are going to jump right into things this morning. So our Better Together message this week is about two cousins whose story is found in the Old Testament book of Esther. Esther is one of those cousins, and her cousin's name is Mordecai. And this week we're going to talk about Esther and Mordecai, redemptive remembrancers. Now, a remembrancer is someone whose job it is to help somebody else remember something. Now, in all honesty, when Miriam first told me this word, I kind of thought it was a made-up word. It was like one of those, really? Is that a thing, a remembrancer? But actually, to my shame, it's an English word. And yeah, you've got me there, right? An English word, not what is spoken here. And so a remembrancer is actually the oldest position in the Queen or the King's court in England. It goes all the way back to the 1100s. Now, the role actually for us isn't that great because the job of the remembrancer was to remind the King or the Queen of what taxes hadn't been paid and things like that. So I didn't want to dwell on that much as I was preparing this week, but when I was thinking about remembering, the phrase that came to my mind again and again was that little phrase, "lest we forget." That thing that we hear most often on Memorial Day, where we remember those who've given their lives in service of this country, of other countries. And that little phrase, "lest we forget," actually has some history. And it has some history also back in England, so I connected there again. It was written in a poem by Rudyard Kipling in 1897. Queen Victoria was on the throne. She was celebrating her Diamond Jubilee, 60 years on the throne, and the nation was rejoicing. And Rudyard Kipling had been told to write a poem in order to help the nation celebrate. But he took things in a little different direction. Rather than having this kind of triumphant poem, he wanted to remind the people that those things are fleeting, yet the Lord is permanent. And so in 3 of the 5 verses, he closes those verses. The poem's called Recessional, if any of you ever want to look it up. In 3 of those 5 verses, he closes with, "Lord God of hosts, be with us yet, lest we forget, lest we forget." And what he's doing there is he's actually going into a biblical practice. If we reach back all the way through into the Old Testament, Moses, after he has kind of given the Israelites a little bit of a history lesson, when the nation is being established, before he lays out all the laws, in Deuteronomy 4, verse 9, commands the people this. He says, "Only take care and keep your soul diligently, lest you forget the things that your eyes have seen, and lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life. Make them known to your children and your children's children." This morning, we want to explore together the value of remembering.
You'll notice that at the end of our title for today, we have a question mark. And up front, we want to be clear that unlike our previous pairs in this teaching series, we're going to propose to you this morning that Esther and Mordecai do not give us a picture of flourishing relationships. This isn't to suggest that they do not have incredibly important roles in moving God's purposes forward. But we're going to see that it's actually in their lack, in their weakness, that speaks to us the loudest. Steve and I began our process for this message in a very different place than we've ended up this morning. Through deep study and prayer and conversation together, we feel confident about what we're offering to you this morning and excited to bring you along in the journey. If you have always seen Esther and Mordecai as heroic figures, as we had, then we invite you to remain curious with us, to come to God's scripture with an open heart and join us in trusting that it is good and true and that there's something important for us together. I'd like to share a story with you. Between 2014 and 2016, I said goodbye to 2 deeply meaningful church ministry jobs. These were jobs that allowed me to live out deep passions and callings. I stepped out of the first one and into the second one only because it was so compelling to me. It was in a place called home with the people that I adored and the hope of a long and fruitful future. And then rather quickly, it all came crashing down in injustice and heartbreak. And my soul, like many of yours, became acquainted with the deep pain of church wounding. What was clarity and dreams in my life became confusion and grief. I stepped out of a sense of purpose and intention in God's kingdom and into darkness and doubt. And very quickly, after I stepped out of that role, my first child was born. And I walked into the beautiful but incredibly disorienting and lonely, long days of stay-at-home young motherhood. My prayers, when I prayed them, to be honest, were full of doubt. They were full of anger. I couldn't see what God was doing. And the parts of me that had once known confidence in God's presence, the parts of me that knew calling and longing to participate in intentional, on-purpose ways in God's kingdom, became buried and forgotten. And honestly, on days that I could forget them, the days felt easier. Now, I didn't intentionally forget about my belonging to God. I don't think you do either, right? We don't forget on purpose about God's redemptive activity in our lives, but life hurts. And our stories can become obstacles that take us to forgetful places. I needed a redemptive remembrancer. I'm not alone in that, right? We need redemptive remembrancers. We need people to call attention to God's action in our lives and remind us of our belonging to Him.
So, like Miriam said, we're going to go in a little bit of a different direction this morning. And in order to do that, we need to understand a couple of big picture things from the Bible. And to do that, we need to really start at the beginning. So it's not long after reading in Genesis that you get to the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, where things go wrong and man's relationship with God is broken. Things are bad. But then as you keep reading through the stories, you get to the story of Abraham. Abraham was a man who God chose. He changed his name to Abraham, and he made a covenant. He made a promise with Abraham. And the promise, he said, was that through Abraham, the whole earth would be blessed, that what had gone wrong would be redeemed, and that man would once again have relationship with God. And we know as we read through our scriptures that ultimately this was fulfilled in Jesus. But in the Old Testament, this blessing of the earth, this redemption was entrusted to Abraham's family, to the Jewish people, to the nation of Israel. See, it was their job to be redemptive remembrancers. It was their job to remember who they belonged to and call attention to God's actions in the earth. So what happens as we continue reading? The garden story, that Eden story, repeats itself again and again. Israel sins. Consequences ensue. But God remains faithful to his covenant, to his promise. He saves his people. He redeems them and restores relationship with them. When we think of the stories through the Old Testament, think of the story of Joseph or of Daniel. Looking forward in our series to the next couple of weeks, next week, Kaylin and Joe will talk about Ruth and Naomi, or the week after, Michael and Beth with Deborah and Barak, stories of redemption. Even looking back, when Beth and I spoke of the Old Testament story of David and Jonathan, and how the people were saved from the Philistine army. But the big one, the big story, was the one that Scott Boyd and Michael told last week, the story of Moses and Aaron. This is the one that became kind of the overarching metaphor for Israel. The story of the escape from Egypt, the plagues culminating in the Passover. This metaphor, this meal that became part of society, where every year was remembered year and year again, that ultimately became communion as we shared this morning. This is how Israel remembered their redemption, through Passover and remembering God's covenant. So our story this week, the story of Esther, is another story of redemption for Israel, but it's a story with a twist. In fact, at the start of the book of Esther, nothing is actually wrong. Esther and Mordecai are living in peace. So if we understand the lot of Israel in the Old Testament often depended on which world superpower was in place. So when Babylon was in place, things were really, really bad, because Babylonian foreign policy said, we will exile people, we will keep them from experiencing life as they would want to experience it. But at the time of Esther, Babylon wasn't in power, Persia was in power. And Persia's foreign policy was actually to let people live out their religion as they saw fit. So Esther and Mordecai were free to worship, they were free to remember God, they were free to express all that it was to be a Jew in those times. But if you read the whole book, if you read Esther 10 chapters start to finish, you will find no mention of the covenant. You'll find no mention of God. Not once within those chapters is his name there. And with those pieces in place, we want to dive into the story together.
Okay, so first up, we meet King Xerxes, who is also known as Ahasuerus. And he essentially gets snubbed by his wife, Queen Vashti, in front of his friends. He's ticked off, and in a narcissistic rage, he fires her from her position as queen. And then his friends propose to him that he go on a citywide search for young virgins. And he bring them into his palace, into the harem, and from them, he pick the one that he's the most pleased with, and that she becomes the queen. He's into this idea, so the edict goes out. But this isn't a beauty pageant. This is sexual exploitation. Next in the story, we meet Mordecai and Esther in chapter 2.
Now there was a Jew in Susa the citadel whose name was Mordecai. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther. So Esther was her Persian name that's used for the name of the book and all the way through. The daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa the citadel in custody of Hegai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace.
Esther's clearly favored early on, and she undergoes an entire year of beauty treatments, including oils and perfumes for an entire year, so that she has one chance on one night to please the king in his bedroom. Esther would have been young, a teenager. And from the time that she was a young child, she has been forbidden by Mordecai to reveal her Jewish identity, to show her connection to the Jewish covenant, the covenant with God that Steve was talking about. And before she goes to the harem, Mordecai again commands her again to keep her Jewish identity quiet. And he walks every day in the harem courtyard to check on her. Well, eventually, Esther's night comes, and the king is pleased with her. And he places the crown upon her head. She is now Queen Esther.
And then at this point in chapter 3, the story switches, and it focuses on Esther's cousin Mordecai and a new character whose name is Haman. Mordecai and Haman both served in the king's court. And in chapter 3, we read how Haman was promoted to second in command. And so now, as he is second in command, etiquette demands that everybody should now bow before Haman. But Mordecai refuses to bow. Now, this is one of those points where, as Miriam and I studied this week, we initially saw like a noble action to him not bowing. But as we dug deeper, at best we could say that he had mixed motives for that. And the problem with him not bowing was it made Haman incredibly angry, to the point that Haman begins to plot a gruesome death for Mordecai. And not only for Mordecai, but he begins to plot annihilation for all of the Jews. We read about it in chapter 3, verses 12 to 13.
Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and an edict according to all that Haman commanded was written. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with instruction to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods.
So we don't have time to tell the rest of the story in much detail, but I'd encourage all of you, read the book of Esther. It's a quick read. It's 10 chapters. You can read it through in one go, and it is a fascinating story. But things then take a turn for the better in the end. Mordecai gets word to Esther within the harem that this edict has been sent out and that she is in danger and that all the Jews are in danger. She then reveals to the king that she is a Jew and that she is under threat from his order, from Haman's plan. The king's anger is turned on Haman. It does not go well for him. In fact, the very manner of death that he had planned for Mordecai gets visited on him. And once he is out the way, Esther and Mordecai are given power by the king to save the Jews. But in our passage that Miriam just read, there's one detail that we can miss that we need to see. See, at the start, in that dating of when this thing was happening, all of these events are happening at the time of the Passover.
We can't miss this timing. Remember, let's go back to the covenant. Mordecai and Esther belong to the people of God, who, because of the covenant, have a critical job, which is to remember their belonging to God, to stay in connection with God, and to participate in his calling in calling attention to his action in the world, because this is what redemptive remembrancers do. And yet, Mordecai and Esther neglect this truth. So the annihilation edict is declared on the 13th day of the first month, which doesn't mean much to us. But if I said to you, the 24th day of the 12th month, you would know that that's Christmas Eve, right? That's what's happening here under the surface, is that the Jewish readers would have known that this was the day before Passover. And Passover is the week-long celebration that remembers God's rescue of his people from slavery. So during Passover, the edict goes out. Mordecai appeals to Esther to do something. Esther feasts with the king and then makes her plea to him to save her people. Passover wasn't optional. It was commanded by God. And yet, Esther and Mordecai aren't celebrating, but they don't even show an awareness that it's happening. And then, to add insult to injury, when Esther does make her request to the king, here's how she does it in chapter 7, verse 4.
For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king.
Now, I think Esther is doing her best. And yet, if we really catch what she's saying here, she says to the king, if it was only slavery that my people were being sold into, I wouldn't have spoken up. But since it's killing them, I decided to say something. The entire story of Passover is undermined in her language here. Biblical scholar John Donne, who is helpful to us in our process, articulates it really well here. He says this in his book: at a time when the great deeds of the Exodus would have been retold, when the sovereignty of God over foreign threats would have been proclaimed, and when the deliverance of Israel would have been relished in, the Jews in Susa showed no trust in God and no sense of confidence. Esther and Mordecai are ignorant of God's movement in and around them. They are living in a secular culture in which they have completely assimilated. Esther is an orphan who experiences the trauma of sexual exploitation. She is young. Her story is complicated. And we don't know all of Mordecai's story. We're not suggesting that their ignorance here is only consciously willful. However, this story reveals to us that they forget something really important: the remembering of their identity as God's people and their calling to represent him. It's not here.
See, Passover is not actually all they forget. Remember, these Esther and Mordecai are free to travel back to Jerusalem, back to their homeland, back to where their people are, but they've chosen to stay. When Esther marries the king, despite all the circumstances that lead up to that, there's no mention of inner conflict. See, foreign marriage was prohibited by law, and neither Mordecai nor Esther show any hesitancy about this. When Esther calls for fasting before going to the king, something critical is forgotten. There's no prayer. There's no calling on God of her people to rescue them, like he did during Passover. She's fasting with her handmaids who don't even share the same faith. You see, that silence through this book, where the name of God, where covenant is not mentioned, begins to speak louder and louder. But in spite of their forgetfulness, God remembers his promise to them. God is faithful. God does not hold their forgetfulness against them. Esther, Mordecai, the Jewish people, they are spared from annihilation. God remembers us even when we forget him. So the story ends. Esther and Mordecai are given more influence and power by the king. They become top leaders in Susa, and it seems a cause to celebrate. And in some ways it is. But what we don't see is we don't see a return to intimacy and trust with God. They're not calling on his name or using their new position to remind the Jews, to remind the people that they belong to God, to remind them of their job, to give witness in the earth to God's actions, to be redemptive remembrancers. See, God invites us as his people into so much more. We are invited into a relationship of trust, of dependence. See, yes, God did save his people because he is good and he is faithful, but he offers us so much more.
I wonder if Mordecai at some moment would have been a redemptive remembrancer for Esther, or Esther a redemptive remembrancer for Mordecai. How would that have impacted their relationship with Yahweh God? How much more would they have experienced the depth of God's presence, his kindness, his trustworthiness, and his love? And not just for them, but for all of the Jews that they were leading. In that season that I shared with you earlier, the dark and forgetful one, I needed a redemptive remembrancer to call attention to God's action in my life and my belonging to him. And because God is the God who remembers us even when we forget him, he brought me one. It was a winter morning, and I came to church by myself. My kids were unwell, and it had been a particularly challenging couple of weeks, and I sat through the service pretty angsty. And the service concluded, and I turned around to Michael. And he began what I think he thought was a pretty, average conversation. But within 10, 15 seconds, it became completely clear to me that this was a sacred conversation. God had sent him to me as a redemptive remembrancer. Michael knew of the pain of the season that I had been in. And with strength, he stepped into my weakness. He stepped into my places of forgetfulness. And essentially, here's what he told me. God sees you, Miriam. You are not forgotten, and you still belong to him. And there are still meaningful ways for you to join in to his kingdom work. I desperately needed to remember that I belong to God first and foremost, and that God was still redeeming the broken things in my life. It was a pivotal moment for me, and it wasn't because everything got real rosy and clear after that. In fact, things got more confusing. Things on the outside didn't look any better, but on the inside, I was experiencing a shift. I walked forward from that moment with Michael into a greater confidence in my care from Jesus, in my belonging to God. And I walked into deeper trust in God's good and redemptive work in my life. I have experienced more of God as a result. And that is the truest gift. And as I have remembered that story with Steve, and as I tell it to you this morning, I am emboldened to be a redemptive remembrancer I want to cooperate with God's Spirit in what God's Spirit is doing in the lives of others by reminding them that they belong to God, that they are safe and secure in His hand, and that God is up to good things that He is not done with them. Because we're better together when we do that.
So, through this series, we've each week had that transformational truth and then that question to ask. So, redemptive remembrancers call attention to God's action in our lives and our belonging to Him. So, the question we want you to ask this morning is, who might you help remember that they belong to God and have purpose in His kingdom? So, we're going to hold that on the screen, and we're just going to take 15, 30 seconds just to pause quietly and to think of who might that be in your life. Now, we know that for some of us, a name will have come instantly to our heads. But for others, like, oh, the pressure, I couldn't think of anybody. If you didn't get a name now, take time this week. Don't feel like it has to happen in that moment. We've heard stories of people feeling like, is there something wrong there? I didn't get a name in that moment. No. Take time this week. Take a walk on the trail. Sit on your porch when it's not 100 degrees or something like that, and ask God, who might that person be? Because the stories we're hearing through this series are stories of people making phone calls, people reconnecting with people from these questions that we've been asking and seeing real change. But we're also hearing stories of people share their real needs where they're longing for a sacred friend or a faithful companion or an unlikely brother. These are places people are in. So when you get that nudge, I encourage you, listen to the Holy Spirit. Pick up that phone, make that call to connect with people.